Management history of the Inupiaq bowhead whale hunt. International policy making. There is a ritualistic importance to the cultures that hunt whales for subsistence. This relationship extends beyond just feeding the community that harvests the whale. Bowhead whales were commercially harvested by Westerners since the mid-19th century. In 1977, the International Whaling Commission omitted Aboriginal whale hunters from whaling exemption without notice from the whaling communities. To understand why the IWC made this recommendation, we must look briefly at some of the history of whaling in international waters. The year is 1864 and is regarded as the beginning of modern whaling when cannon-fired, explosive harpoons, and powered boats became predominant. By the mid-19th century, the United States whaling fleet was over 600 vessels, and in 1848, the western Arctic population of bowhead whale was discovered. After crude oil began to be utilized in the United States, whale oil demand went down, but the western Arctic bowhead whales were still sought after for their baleen. Commercial bowhead whale harvest was down to 10% of their usual average, and in 1908, the baleen market crashed after a flexible steel was invented and women's fashion changed. The bowhead whale fishery ended in 1914, but Alaska Native communities still pursued the bowhead whale. Since many of the coastal stocks of whales around the world had been depleted, whalers went to the high seas. These are international waters, and the thought of the time was that no nation could prevent access to any resources from international waters of the high seas. The Convention for the Regulation of Whaling was signed in Geneva in 1931 through the League of Nations. It was the first step in a plan to set international regulation on whaling. The agreement was applicable in all waters around the world, including national waters, and offered exemption to subsistence whaling. The specific guidelines for Aboriginal whaling were laid out by the convention as follows. They only use canoes, pirogues, or other exclusively native craft propelled by oars or sails. They do not carry firearms. They are not in the employment of persons other than Aborigines. They are not under contract to deliver their products of their whaling to any third person. In 1946, the International Whaling Conference was held in Washington, D.C., by the United States to create new International Commission on Whaling. The commission provided complete protection for some species and created whale sanctuaries along with other catch requirements. After the Land Claims Settlement Act in 1971, Native communities on the North Slope began moving towards a more cash-oriented society, and more technology became accessible to any whaling captain who had the necessary funds. The emerging cash-based economies were funding a small fleet of village whalers. The number of Alaskan Native whaling crews on the North Slope doubled, and there were reports of high struck but lost rates, meaning the whale was struck with a weapon but escaped and may have died. This inevitably caught the attention of the International Whaling Commission. The IWC is a group of whaling nations, and with the United Nations established harvest quotas and regulations for national and international waters. In the 1960s, management of whale stocks were placed in the hands of scientific committees of the IWC, and in 1974, specific stocks were to be managed individually. After specific stocks were being looked at individually, this put Alaska Natives on the radar of the IWC. As the IWC Science Committee began to look closer at the bowhead whale Aboriginal hunting around Greenland, the Soviet Arctic, and Alaska, what the IWC saw was a rapid increase in whales harvested on the North Slope. From 1910 to 1969, catches averaged about 12 per year, but were averaging now 32 per year by 1977. The increase in harvest and the evidence of high struck but lost ratios led the scientific committee to strongly recommend the steps be taken to reduce the lost rate with increasing harvest. In 1976, it had been reported that 48 whales had been successfully harvested, while 43 had been struck but lost, and 79 were struck but lost in 1977. Prior to 1973, the struck but lost average was 10 whales. It was estimated that before modern whaling, bowhead populations were between 18,000 and 11,700. By 1977, were between 600 and 2,000. These estimates led the IWC to recommend that all bowhead whale harvests should be stopped immediately. The IWC had decided to end the bowhead whale hunt without talking to any subsistence communities or even acknowledging to them that there was any growing concern. As soon as Native Alaskan whaling communities heard about the ban, they created the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission the same year. The AEWC represents the 9 whaling villages and lobbies for subsistence rights of whaling communities. The United States government agreed to allow a small harvest quota for whaling communities with regulation to reduce losses during hunts. The United States government agreed to allow a harvest of 30 bowhead whales a year based on need. The IWC recommendation was no more than 18 strikes to harvest 12 bowhead whales. The following year, with improved research techniques, scientists estimated 2,260 bowhead whales off the north coast of Alaska. By the early 1980s, this number would be revised to 7,800. At 7,800 bowhead whales in the western Arctic, this qualifies as sustained management stock, as specified by the IWC. In 1979, a working group was established to meet the needs of the whaling communities, and along with conservationists. Prior to 1979, there was a huge research gap because scientific data was not being collected on harvest. Another problem that arose in the 1970s was how was the IWC to define subsistence and how were they to quantify need, or if the native Alaskan communities truly need the bowhead whale at all. In 1979, the IWC's nutritional panel said there is no unusual nutritional requirements that require the consumption of bowhead whale. The IWC's cultural panel stated, "Wants are different from needs," explaining that a people's preference for a particular way of hunting or taste for a given type of food should not allow them to exterminate another species. The IWC had no cultural committee designated to northern Alaska or ways of gathering data that was not science-based. It was eventually determined by the IWC that the definition of Aboriginal subsistence whaling was whaling for purposes of local Aboriginal consumption carried out by or on behalf of Aboriginal, Indigenous, or Native peoples who share strong community, familial, social, and cultural ties related to the continuing traditional dependence on whaling and on the use of whales. The United States reported to the IWC that the most important aspect of the bowhead whale hunt was cultural need. Cultural need proved difficult to quantify to the IWC, so the baseline for cultural need was set for the recorded harvest data during the 1960s from whaling communities, and it was determined that 18 to 21 whales were required to satisfy cultural need. Initial harvest quotas were based largely on historic need, the period between 1930 and 1969, before the villages became largely mixed economies. Prior to the question of indigenous Alaskans and subsistence bowhead whale hunt, the IWC had no procedures for subsistence whaling. The predecessor of the IWC, the International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling, had laid down some of the groundwork for the IWC, but the IWC did not specify methods used by Aboriginals. By the 19th century, Native Alaskan whalers were already incorporating bomb lances and shoulder guns. In pre-contact times, whaling crews traveled in skin umiaks. A harpoon with rawhide floats first struck the whale to exhaust the whale and to let it be more easily tracked. Then the whale's tendons were cut with a lance so the final blow could be landed. Umiaks are still the preferred whaling vessel, but lances and harpoons have been replaced with bomb lances and shoulder guns, which essentially fire a bomb at the whale. Charms were once carried in Umiaks on the hunt, and these relics were considered very powerful objects. Elaborate rituals and taboos once surrounded the whale hunts. In Point Hope, anyone who had recently had a death in the family was not allowed to participate in a hunt until the first whale had been killed. Even use of a canoe from a family that had recently had a death. During whaling season, some villages had a practice of keeping the whalers in separate living quarters from the rest of the community. Many of the recorded rituals involve the idea of enticing the soul of the whale to the shore or the hunters' homes. Lantis states, whalers use special implements and gear, not just because of the special technical requirements of whale hunting, but because whale hunting was something apart from the rest of life, more sacred and more dangerous. Archaeological evidence shows that bowhead whales have been part of the culture on the North Slope for hundreds of years. The placement of villages on the North Slope were probably selected because of their proximity to the whale's migration route. Contemporary whale hunting on Alaska's North Slope has not changed much in the last 50 years. In spring, after a whale is killed, it is pulled onto the ice with block and tackle, but in fall it is hauled into the tundra with heavy machinery. After it is out of the water, the goal is to reduce the whale into nothing but bones. The post-hunt involves lots of celebrating and feasting with the crew and community. The whaling captain's wife has a huge responsibility of serving hot drinks to the people helping with the butchering, and then cooking for the community after the whale is butchered. The wife of the captain may have to cook for hundreds of people, multiple times. A flag will go up over the captain's house, and it will be announced over the VHF that they are done preparing their feast, and anyone from the community is welcome to come partake. The captain's wife usually has 2 separate cooking stoves. It is expected of the captain to throw a celebration. This usually involves a blanket toss after the feast. The blanket is made from an Umiaq cover. Today, Aboriginal subsistence whaling is practiced by Greenland, Russia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Alaska, who are all members of the IWC. The IWC now works closely with the governments and community groups to ensure the needs of subsistence communities are met. Subsistence whale harvests in the North Slope of Alaska net between 1.1 and 2 million pounds of food for the communities. This would equate to $11 million to $30 million in beef products. The IWC has since created specific management strategies for Aboriginal whalers as a result of the situation with Alaska Native whalers in the 1970s. Despite having lost many of the old traditions through Christianity, it is believed that the overall spirit of the whale hunt very much so maintains its integrity. Thank you.